How's it going? I'm Sandy. Thanks everybody for coming. Who here has written a Spark job before? Cool, it's like about half. Who here wrote that Spark job in Scala versus Python? I don't know how you would raise your hand in response to that. Scala, raise your hand. Python, raise your hand. Oh, okay, also about a quarter and a quarter. Sorry, I have a sort of weird setup here. It might take me a second to get oriented. Thanks everybody for coming. I'm basically going to give you a talk that is a use case walkthrough. The goal here is to give you a sort of basic understanding of what it looks like to build out a simple NLP application with Spark. Before we start, quickly about me. I'm a data scientist at Cloudera. I led Cloudera Spark development a little while ago, but have gotten out of that game a little bit, and I wrote, I know what's going on. Sorry, I have two different little things going on over here. All right. I wrote some of this book, which has some of the content that we're going to be talking about tonight. So we're going to be talking about a technique in natural language processing called latent semantic analysis. And latent semantic analysis is basically a fancy name for applying a matrix decomposition to some text data. We're going to be applying this technique on a data set that I imagine some of you are familiar with. It's Wikipedia. It's the full Wikipedia set of English documents, which is about 5 million documents. To analyze 5 million documents is about, I think, 46 gigs, which is not huge, but perhaps you want to look at all the languages. You need some sort of system that allows you to process that amount of data, do complex stuff, leverage tons of CPU and cores. And to our rescue here, we have this system called Apache Spark, which basically allows you to do this and do it in a very simple way. So everyone here, I assume, has heard of Spark. Who's heard of LSA, or latent semantic analysis? Okay, SVD. Oh wow, it's like a lot. Maybe you can correct me when I say things that are false about it. There we go. So what does it look like to carry out this analysis practically? We have some sort of raw data. We want to parse it. Figure out how to actually understand whatever binary format it's in. We want to clean it. We want to assemble it into some sort of form that we can feed into matrix decomposition. We want to actually carry out that matrix decomposition, and then we want to interpret the results. So you'll notice that a full maybe 50, maybe higher percent of the steps here have nothing to do with math or statistics or machine learning. And so it goes with actually doing most analyses and building most data applications. Most of the work lies in finding the data, pre-processing the data, understanding how to read it, and then assembling it into some format that actually allows you to do your analysis. Also, please stop me for questions at any point. I'm a big fan of interruptions. If at any point you are confused or curious about something in particular. So let's first talk about the raw data that we're dealing with here. We have the full Wikipedia data set, which is all available online. It's XML formatted. It's about 46 gigs uncompressed. And this is a little sample of what some of it looks like. So we have this sort of XML structure that it's fed into, and then basically they launch into this full text. There's all this crazy little formatting and stuff that we have to deal with, and then the actual words that we care about. So how do we read this data? How do we understand this ugly ass format? Luckily, reading and parsing Wikipedia XML data is something that people have been doing for a little while in a lot of different settings. Apache Mahout has a nice XML input format, which is a MapReduce input format that allows you to split up this enormous XML file into individual documents that we can use. This is some Spark code that does it. And so while this is an input format that was originally built for MapReduce, Spark is able to leverage any sort of MapReduce input format that was written for any strange data set. And you can just feed it in this nice, beautiful little way. We're referencing the XML input format and then the two data types that it returns. Whenever you use a MapReduce input format, you return key value pairs, which is a little bit more constricting than the generality that Spark has. We only care about the value. We only care about the string, the text. So in this map function down there, we pull that out. So this is what it takes to open up Wikipedia data in Spark. If you look at this, once we've already done this, so we'll have these nice little pieces given to each Spark partition. If we map over them, we'll get a document per record. But there's still all this junk in here that we want to deal with. So I'm gonna elide a couple steps that are the ugliest. So that, let's say, remove punctuation and do splitting of strings and cut to maybe the somewhat interesting part of the cleaning step. So what we'd like to do with latent semantic analysis is look at documents, find out which terms show up in them, and then compare them to other documents based on the terms that show up in those documents. So doing this and looking at the co-occurrences, the similarities of documents for terms and terms for documents, we're able to come up with some sort of understanding of the relationships between terms and documents. Using this understanding, we apply this matrix decomposition to uncover some lower dimensional representation of the full corpus of data. So the idea is that the full corpus of data is some sort of lower dimensional representation plus a bunch of noise on top of it. So by applying LSA and looking for the lowest dimensional low dimensional representation that still fits the data pretty well, we're able to get rid of all this noise and uncover what are some of the key concepts, the key structure underlying the data set that we're looking at. So to do this, and it all revolves around this concept of co-occurrences. So this term shows up in this document. It also shows up in this document. Therefore, these documents are probably likely to be related in some sort of way. And that relationship increases as the number of terms that co-occur increase. In actual English, there are lots of ways to say the same thing, both on a sentence and higher level, but also on a particular word level. So we all have all sorts of punctuation and grammar. Let's say cactus and cacti. If we see cactus in one document and cacti in another document, we'd probably like to strengthen the relationship between those documents, even though we don't have the exact same string of characters. So it's important that we're able to reduce these down into some canonical form for each term or for each entity that we care about. The process of doing this is called lemmatization. And the little roots of the words, we call them lemmas. So we'd like to be able to take strings like the boys' cars are different colors and convert them into these canonical forms like this nice English sentence, the boy car be different color. Doing this can be really simple. If you are familiar with stemming, stemming is sort of a low-grade way of doing lemmatization where you look at particular strings and apply a bunch of heuristics to them to try to get to their roots. Then you can go fancier and look at context, look at the words around, try to understand what the part of speech that a particular word is in a sentence, and be a little more intelligent at this lemmatization process. This is fun stuff, but it's also hard stuff. So luckily, we do not have to do it ourselves. There is a really nice library, the Stanford CoreNLP library, which provides this functionality. So calling it is basically as simple as this little bit of code. The way it works is you build up these little NLP pipelines these little steps of operations that have to happen in sequence on a document in order to understand it. In this particular case, there are a few steps that are required before lemmatization. First, you have to tokenize the document. You need to split it up. POS stands for part of speech tagging, which is used as input into the lemmatization process. And then you actually do lemmatization itself. Any questions on this stuff before we keep going?
Do you support many languages? English or English only?
I believe that Stanford CoreNLP project does have support for other languages. So it's trained on some reference data set, which I think is maybe a Wall Street Journal data set, which happens to be in English. They might have other reference data sets for other languages, but you can also take your own reference if you have some huge corpus of documents and train it yourself and use those weights for the process. Any other questions?
In the first slide, you mentioned loading Wikipedia data, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, is there any difference between loading it as a normal text file versus loading it from what you've done, like in the background? Does it differ, or is it the same thing? They're just gonna load it into an RTT?
So yeah, the question was, is there any difference between what we did there and loading up a normal text file? So when you load up a normal text file into Spark, you probably use the text file API, and that's going to give you one record per line. So it's going to use the split points as the new line characters. In this case, we want to have one, because we care about documents and the set of words that show up in a document, we need to group the lines that are in a document together. So the XML input format is actually going to do that and put multiple lines into a single record. That makes sense. But the APIs are very similar. If you look at the invocation back over here, this is, if you look inside text file, it's basically calling this, but passing in text input format instead of XML input format. Mm-hmm.
Do you actually parse the wiki script? So basically an XML file, it's not a plain text or graphical. It's a wiki script.
Yeah, great question. So I highlighted that as well, but there is a nice library. I actually forget the name, even though I used it, which, so let's look at this script again, which has an understanding of this wiki script and is able to strip out the relevant stuff and do the appropriate kind of things. I think it's called Cloud9. I think someone put it together. Any other questions before we keep going? Cool. So another thing that we want to think about when we do this analysis is we have these words that show up in almost every document. So the is going to show up in every document, be is going to show up in every document. Including these in our analysis is only going to add noise. So it's possible that we can find an algorithm that's robust to this sort of dilution. But ultimately, we know that these words are conveying no extra signal. So it's pretty common in these kinds of applications to go through, look at every word in every document and strip out all the thes and bees and some list of 140 words. If you look online, it's easy to get these lists of common stop words and have them stripped out. So this brings us to maybe the heart of the process, the heart of the pipeline, which is building the term document matrix. Who's heard of the term document matrix? Oh man, okay, great. So for those who are unfamiliar, for those who want a refresher, this is a term document matrix. It's simply a matrix where we have as the columns particular terms and as the rows particular documents, or the other way around. But in this case, because we have a record per document, we're looking at documents as rows. And then at each cell in our matrix, we want to express the affinity for a particular term to a particular document. If the term doesn't show up in that document at all, we're going to say that term has no affinity for that document. And if it does, we want to have a higher number. One very simple way that we could construct a term document matrix like this is basically have in each cell the number of occurrences of a particular term in a particular document. And this is a nice thing, but for our purposes, it's a little bit skewed it, for example, would give extra weight to documents that have lots and lots of terms in our analysis versus documents that have small number of terms. Another problem with it is that terms that show up very often, we probably want those to have less weight on our analysis. So if half the documents in our corpus have the word algorithm in it, because we're looking at some pretty skewed computer science corpus, we want the occurrence of algorithm in a document to matter less. We care less if algorithm shows up in a document because algorithm shows up in almost every document. So in addition to being the relevance of a particular term to a particular document, it's also sort of a indicator of how much we care about that relationship. To the rescue is this scheme, this common scheme for filling out the entries of this term document matrix called TFIDF. It stands for term frequency times inverse document frequency. It starts out with this with term frequency, which is basically the number of times that a particular term shows up in a document. And then IDF deals with the other problem that we were sort of discussing, which is that many words can show up in tons of documents. And so we compute this score for every word, not for every document word pair, which is called the IDF, the inverse document frequency of that particular word. And that's simply 1 over the number of documents in the entire corpus that contain that word. The inverse document frequency of something that shows up very often in the data set would be very small. In reality, instead of just using the inverse document frequency by itself, we usually take the log of it because that's the sort of distribution that term occurrences in documents tend to take. Any questions on that before we keep going?
I just got a question. You had this matrix before. If you go back, what document about monkey and algorithm is it talking about?
That's a great question. You don't know about the monkey algorithm. Yeah. You should look it up. It bridges sort of the tail aspect of the world and the Scala aspect of the world. So what does it look like to actually represent this term document matrix in Spark and in Scala? The best way to do it is probably to build an RDD of vectors. These vectors are not java.util.vectors. They are org.apache.spark.linalg.vectors. What is it, Shangri? A vector can be represented either by a dense vector, which uses a array under the covers. I think delegates down to a library called Breeze, which allows you to do sort of NumPy, BLAST type operations on these arrays. Or there's a sparse representation, which stores vectors as a sequence of index and value pairs. In this case, I think we probably want to be using the sparse representation because in any particular document, the words that show up in it are a small fraction of the total number of words that could show up in all documents. So using lots of magic that's totally elided for our purposes, we build up this RDD of vectors from that RDD of strings that we had a little while ago. We apply lemmatization, do all sorts of counts, calculate TF-IDFs, and shove them in these vector structures.
So I tried to work with this, and my problem was that usually documents have some metadata and have some text, as we just saw. And vector is something I can get out of text. Text, I apply TF-IDF, I get vector. So my problem was how do I reconcile those vectors with my document metadata around documents. So you're basically losing the connection between those vectors and how they go back.
So when you say the metadata, is there metadata that you care about other than, let's say, the title of the document?
Of course, yeah. I might need to, sometimes I might need to look at metadata. I might do some work with vectors and translate this into metadata. I might have some basically records inside of the shell. I have a document, I translated to vector, I did some analysis, and then I want to extract topics, for example. attach it to this document.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of difficult to figure out how do I go back to our original document.
Right. So yeah, the way I've traditionally done that has been basically to maintain like so maybe store each vector as a tuple of vector comma ID, which will maybe be a long or a string, and then elsewhere have an RDD or local structure that maps strings to metadata. So you can go and do that mapping. You look confused. Is that something you've tried and has not been great for your problem?
Well, it was, yeah, I think the problem was that Spark itself
Mm-hmm.
was only these vectors, and you do some analysis on this, you get on some stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't really have a way to like get some kind of ID or index of this vector
Right.
and go back to it. So it was not up to
So ML pipelines are supposed to be able to handle this case. I just learned today. The pipelines library,
Oh, okay, maybe, yeah, maybe
they allow you to pass through IDs and other data that are not features of the model.
I think I was looking at like Spark 1, 2, 1, 3, so 191, 4.
Well, I think your point is that hashing TF, which is implemented in MLlib, doesn't like store the actual words after it's
Yeah,
hashed.
it's
So you cannot go
just
back. I think that's the issue. Like the MLlib implementation of TF-IDF,
Mhm.
hashing TF so it strips up the word altogether.
Yeah, I mean, so in my particular analysis, we haven't done hashing TF, so we have. Do you have you?
No, hashing TF doesn't store the words, but we recently merged the count vectorizer and installed the words in the metadata.
It stores so this is with ML Pipelines API.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What you merged the what's it called?
Count vectorizer, the same name as.
Oh, count vectorizer. Count vectorizer. Thank you, all audience members who have answered this question for me. I appreciate it. Any more questions before we keep going? Cool. So now we get to actually apply the SVD. And this is fairly, I guess we should explain what it actually means. So the singular value decomposition is a matrix decomposition. You take some sort of matrix and you decompose it into 3 matrices that when you multiply them back together, achieve the original matrix. We look at our data, we have m number of documents and n number of terms. We're going to get these 3 matrices. U is a m by n matrix. S is so we're assuming that we have fewer documents than terms in this situation, or rather fewer terms than documents. In the Wikipedia data set, we have 5 million documents, and there's probably something like 50,000 or 100,000 relevant terms that we care about for a particular analysis like this. So the minimum number there determines the minimum number of the terms and documents determines the number of the shape of these matrices that we look at. So assuming that n is the number of terms and that's smaller than the number of documents, we have this matrix U, which is m by n. And we'll actually show these in a second. We have this matrix S, which is n by n, and we have a matrix V, which is n by n as well. So what does this actually look like? So there's our U matrix, there's our S matrix, and there is our V matrix. The U matrix roughly gives us information about all the documents in our corpus. The V matrix gives us information about all the terms in our corpus. And then the S matrix is a matrix that sort of unites the two and gives a particular rank on the different combinations here. So let's be a little bit less hand wavy about this, and also talk about this concept of a low rank approximation. Let me go back. So the central idea of applying LSA, of applying latent semantic analysis to our corpus, as we talked about earlier, is we'd like to uncover some sort of lower dimensional representation of our corpus that we think is somehow more true to it. We hope that our corpus is some sort of more condensed representation plus a bunch of noise. And if we look, if we throw away all that noise and look for what's simpler, we can get more information about what is going on. So what particularly is this low rank approximation going to do? First of all, it's going to help us account for synonymy by condensing related terms. So synonymy is the situation where the same word, or rather two words mean the same thing and tend to show up in the same concept, the same context. So you maybe method and function. We all know these are not exactly the same thing, but they probably show up in a lot of the same contexts, probably mean a lot of the same things. So the low rank approximation ideally will be able to account for this synonymy and show the connection between method and function. And when we say show the connection, we might mean that when we look at two different documents and want to look at how similar they are to each other, if we see method in one of the documents and function in another document, we count that toward their similarity, which without this low rank representation, we're not at all able to do. So LSA is going to magically uncover these kind of relationships between these different terms for us. We want to account for polysemy by placing less weight on terms that have multiple meanings. So if a particular word has multiple meanings, we can sort of smooth that out and have those connections matter less. So if we see that, let's say, I can't think of any example right now. Someone tell me an example of, what is it?
Mean.
Mean. Great example. I'm going to use that in all my future talks. Thank you. The word mean means a couple things. It means not nice and also means mean. So I hope it clear things up for you. Ideally, we'd like to if we see mean as not nice in one document and mean as to have meaning or imply meaning in another document, we'd like to have not a huge connection between those two documents. So LSA can't actually distinguish between these two meanings in any special way. It doesn't look at the context around particular words, but it can say, let's weight mean a little bit less compared to other words, because we know that it shows up in these two different broad contexts, and allow other words to come up and dictate which documents are similar to each other. And then last of all, we hope it can just sort of throw at the random noise that tends to accrue in real world data. So SVD, singular value decomposition, allows us to find the rank K approximation that has the lowest Frobenius distance from the original matrix.
So can you use it to identify words that have different meanings?
Can you use LSA to identify words that have different meanings? I haven't thought about that. It's possible that you could look at words that decrease in importance in the low rank representation, but I haven't thought about exactly how you do that. That's a good question.
Are the terms you're using only the words, or are they part of speech tagging as well?
So the terms that we're using in this situation are just words, not part of speech tagging. That's actually a great point, that if you wanted to distinguish between mean and meaning, or those two different uses of the word mean, if you had unique terms based on part of speech tagging that you had derived from the Stanford part of speech tagger, that would likely allow you to be more accurate in your analysis.
Are you treating it, the whole document, as just a bag of words, or like is the title heading treated, like emphasizing more words that appear in the title and heading of the document?
So we're treating the entire, so we're not looking at the title at all. That's probably not the cheat, because we think those things might have some effect. And then we're treating the rest as a bag of words. We don't look at ordering, we don't look at any sort of sentence structure, we don't look at any sort of punctuation, just a bag of words. Any other questions? So SVD can find the rank K approximation that has the lowest Frobenius distance from the original matrix. What does that mean? Loosely, it means that we can find a, if our original matrix is in, let's say, n-dimensional space. So we're expressing everything in terms of, if we have 50,000 terms, we're expressing our corpus in 50,000 dimensional space. We can pick some lower number, some number that's lower than 50,000, K. Let's call it, let's say 1,000 perhaps. And we can express our entire corpus in K-dimensional space. So given these three matrices that we decompose, after finding this low rank approximation, we can shove them back together, and we're going to get this 50,000 by 5 million matrix, but it's going to be of lower rank. Like there are fewer basis vectors that are required to express all the information inside that matrix. And in particular, of all the matrices that have rank k, that are expressible with a lower number of dimensions, we're going to find the one that's the closest to the original matrix by this metric called Frobenius distance, which is basically summing all the squares of differences between corresponding elements into matrices. So apologies if this is sort of too quick or too hand-wavy, but please ask me questions about this before we go on. The basic idea here is we're trying to find a low rank approximation that still is somewhat faithful to the original matrix that we were looking at. So as we talked about before, we have these two parameters, m, 5 million documents, n, 50,000 terms, and we add this additional parameter k, which is the number of dimensions in the lower rank representation that we care about. That's something that's chosen by us. We could test out different values if we wanted to. And we use k to basically take this, these three matrices, U, S, and V, and chop them down a little bit. We can basically sort them in a certain way and simply cut off elements to get our lower rank representation. So we end up with these truncated versions of U, S, and V. U is a matrix where every row corresponds to a document, and then we have k columns. S is a matrix where we have a diagonal matrix, so the only non-zero elements are on the diagonal, and it's k by k. And then V, for every column, we have a particular term, and then all the rows are k. So we have, yeah, let's go back here. So one way to think about this is in terms of concepts. So given our enormous data set with 50,000 terms and 5 million documents, we want to decompose it into k concepts that we think are useful enough to represent it. So if we look at our matrices, we have these docs, these documents on the rows and on the columns. Each column is a particular concept. So if we look at this concept, which is one of these columns of our U, of our document concept matrix, we'll have some value for every document. And that value is basically telling you how much that document participates in that concept. So assuming that our LSA or SVD was able to uncover concepts that we think of as concepts, like let's say math, then we would find, along the math concept that all the documents like, let's say, algebraic topology and calculus have high weights in that column, and documents like flowers and San Francisco might have low weights. So again, SVD is able to take our data and decompose it into some set of concepts. The same thing applies for terms. So for each of these columns in our U matrix, we have a corresponding row in our V matrix. So the rows that are, let's say, the farthest left on the document matrix correspond to the rows that are the highest up on the term matrix. So if math is our particular concept, we might see that for the representation of that concept in the term matrix, we see words like calculus, vector, addition, triangle come up, have high weights, where words like flower, apple, Tarzan would have low weights. Does that make some sense? What's really important to understand about this is that there's this matching between columns of the U, the document matrix, and rows of the term, the V matrix. And then what sort of unites these two with this S matrix in the middle is there's going to be a single value for every concept in this S matrix, and we're going to look down as we look at the diagonal of this matrix, and there'll be a value per concept, and that value expresses the importance of that concept in the entire data set. So if the participation of a document in that or a term in that concept explains a lot, or rather, if a concept is able to explain a lot of the variability in the data set, it's going to have a high value in S. It's going to be more important. And if it's a low-grade concept, it's going to be less important and have a lower value inside this diagonal of this S matrix. Any questions on that? Cool. Actually, running this analysis is super nice. You take your RDD of vectors, you build a row matrix out of it, which is simply wrapping it in this row matrix object. You decide on your K. And then you tell the matrix to compute its own SVD, and that gives you back this SVD object, which basically contains these three matrices that we've talked about. You have to tell it to compute U, which is a little bit more expensive if you want to use this U matrix. U is a big matrix, so it's stored as an RDD. Again, it has one element per document, which is per record in our original RDD. And V is a smaller matrix, so it's only going to have, like, say, 50,000 elements in its longest dimension if we only care about 50,000 terms. So we've gotten this nice decomposition, these three matrices, that if we were to multiply together, we would get some sort of similar matrix to the original matrix that we had, but in a lower rank representation. And we'd like to be able to take all these numbers and ask questions of them. One question that we can ask is, what are the top concepts that we care about? What is this? What are the main axes along which our variation in our data is expressed? What dimensions in term space and in document space explain most of the variance in our data? So again, as we talked about before, we can look at our matrices here, and the first concept, the most important concept, will be represented by these little shaded green parts. It's going to be the leftmost column of U, the left and topmost value in S, and the topmost value in V. We can look at the second most important concept, which just moves everything a step over.
So if I wanted to know the top 10 words that describe a particular concept, I just take the most highest value, rank order, the highest value items in the V matrix? Exactly, yeah, and so and that's exactly what this code is doing right here. So to go back, if we're looking at the top words in the top concept, we want to look at basically that green bar, which is the top row of the V matrix, and that's going to have a set of numbers, and each number is going to correspond to a particular term. As you said, we take the numbers which are the highest, and we look at the terms for those particular numbers, and those are the most important terms to those concepts. So this is a bit of it's not really Spark code, it's Scala code that's doing exactly this. It's fetching the V matrix from the SVD, looking for the top values in it, and finding the terms that correspond to it.
So how do you interpret the negative numbers?
How do you interpret negative numbers? Just as less is there some sort of, how would you? I guess you would say that term is very opposed to that particular concept. So they really don't co-occur very much at all, or the incidence of that concept in a document is going to make you unlikely to see that particular term. I think that's right. And then so this is doing the so this bit of code is doing the exact same thing that you were talking about, but for documents. So it's finding for the most important document, or rather the most important concept, what are the particular documents that have the highest affinity for that concept. In this case, we use a distributed and RDD operation to do this because the U matrix, the document space matrix, is represented as an RDD. And the code is pretty concise in Scala for carrying this out. Here's concept one. in our corpus. So these are the terms that have the highest affinity for it, and these are the documents that have the highest affinity for it. It seems like this is little French townships or something like that, which I guess is pretty. Has anybody heard of these places?
Departments.
Departments?
Yeah.
Like there's no equivalent in the U.S. Okay. We'll all just, except for you, remain confused. So yeah. So sorry, what did you say?
The very first term, department.
Department, but so department in like a government sense, like a bureau,
Yeah.
or like a county,
Like a region.
like a region. Okay. So these French little regions apparently explains a lot of the variability in Wikipedia. So maybe we could call this French regions as a way to describe this concept. Maybe there's not a simple way of expressing it, but it seems like these are at least thematically, we've uncovered some set of things that are thematically related. Concept 2. So we have terms like genus, species, moth, family, Lepidoptera, and the documents are all these particular genuses of bugs. So this seems to be related to the biology of bugs. And again, it's kind of cool. Our LSA has totally grouped these together for us. We haven't done any manual supervision to say that, let's say, the word genus is related to the word species, or that Giganternalis is related to Parapodia. Any questions on that? Cool. So this is nice to sort of inspect and make sure that we've done something pretty sane. What if we want to do some particular task that's maybe more useful to someone who's querying? So let's say given a particular set of terms, we'd like to find the closest documents in the latent space. So we're saying we take this simplified representation of all your data. We input a bunch of words, and we want to find documents that are, let's say, conceptually related. So this is a search problem. This is like what you would do in Google. But in addition to just searching based on occurrence, we might find documents that don't have any of the terms that we've searched for. So we might type in method as a search term, and come up with documents that have the word function in those terms, because we know that, or rather, the low representation understands that method and function are pretty related to each other. So what we're interested in when we do this is basically the score for a term and a document. Remember, if we go all the way back over here and we looked at the term document matrix, we had these numbers that express the affinity for a particular term and a particular document. And so if we look at our LSA'd representation, we basically have the same thing. So if we imagine we were to take these three low-rank matrices and multiply them together, we'd again get this term document matrix. But the particular values in this matrix would be a little bit different than the TFIDF values that we figured out earlier. They'd have this merging, this smushing of related words, as well as accounting for polysemy by giving deprioritizing words. And it basically would carry through this low rank approximation back into this reconstructed matrix. So again, if we want to take a particular term and find the documents that are most relevant to it, we look at that term and look at all the scores for all the documents, in the column of that term, and pick the ones that are at the top. If we want to search for multiple terms, we can just do that and smush together those scores to find some sort of weighting. Also, if we were going to do that, we'd probably want to take IDF weights for the terms, for the query terms, in order to prioritize rarer terms in our weighting. So the nice thing is that we don't actually have to reconstruct this enormous matrix. If we were to do so, it would likely be fairly expensive. One fact about this matrix is that because we're doing this LSA and this low rank approximation, it's likely to no longer be sparse like the original matrix was. So we're likely to see non-zero values in a lot more of the spaces. So if we had to reconstruct this, it would be very, it would use a lot of memory space and computation. Luckily, doing this does not require us to do this full reconstruction. We can basically cancel out some terms and in our matrix operations be a little more clever. So one last thing, going back to this, is suppose we don't want to compare a term in a document. Suppose we want to compare two terms. We basically look at the vectors, the columns of this matrix that are associated with those terms, and take the cosine similarity between those two terms. So we take term 1, term 2, do let's say a dot product between them, and that's going to tell us how similar term 1 is to term 2. So this allows us to not just find the top documents for a term, but also find the top terms that are most related to any particular term. That's what this bit of code does. It finds the top terms that are related to a particular term. So if we type in Radiohead as a term, we get Radiohead, lyrically, catchy, riff, lyric. This last one is a little weird, upbeat. Our algorithm is doing something kind of weird, but maybe this should have a negative affinity. If we do print relevant terms for algorithm, we find algorithm, heuristic, compute, constraint, optimization, complexity. These all seem relatively reasonable to us. On the right in that little column, we're looking at the similarity, which is basically the score, the cosine similarity between those two columns. What is, I think this is just the same thing as we had on that last slide. So querying, like we talked about before, the top documents for a particular term. If we type in fir, kind of tree, we get all these trees that are related to fir trees, or maybe they're not particularly related to fir trees, they're just other trees. And so again, this is based on these latent semantic relationships. And I guess that's pretty much the last example that we have. So that is all I have for you. If you want any more detail on this, we recently wrote this book, Advanced Analytics with Spark. There's a chapter that deals with a use case that's much like this. All the code for this is available on GitHub, so you can go there and check it out. And then the MLlib documentation itself has a lot of information on how you can use SVD. It has the hashing TF and the account vectorizer and all this nice stuff that allows you to pursue your NLP quest. I think that's, yeah, thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions.
Can you say something about how long it took to process the data?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I was using a 6-node cluster, which had maybe like 24 cores on each node, and 100 gigs of RAM, something like that. It took about 30 minutes for a full SVD run, and then it was once the results were stored in memory, it was pretty cheap to actually compute those results, scores. Yeah, exactly. Don't quote me on that. It might have been some multiple of that, like 2 hours.
Did you try to do the same with LDA and Google just compare?
I did not compare it with LDA. That would have been, for the actual topic stuff, that would have been interesting. I did not have the chance to do that.
And with Google Vec?
I'm not Google Vec, I'm not familiar with that.
So kind of libraries for term similarity.
Oh, Google Vec, right. Where they've like trained it with like neural nets and stuff like that. I did not have a chance to compare it with those.
What data structures were Spark data structures, and for all these matrices, all Spark data structures?
So the question is, all the matrices that we were looking at were those Spark data structures? Yeah. So when we looked at the row matrix, that's a Spark matrix that's represented by an RDD underneath. There's also a matrix class which sits on top of a Breeze matrix, but has Spark APIs on top of it. Shall we?
Let's do maybe one more question.
One more question. All right. Thank you.